Water. It's a miraculous substance that enables life on our planet, and it often defines where we live and how we make a living. This is especially true in Wyoming. It's still a dry, wide-open land where agriculture claims more than 80% of the state's water use.
There's a tremendous need for people in Wyoming and the western United States to understand where their water comes from. People need to understand the connection between these high mountain environments where we collect the snow and we generate the runoff, and then what happens further on downstream. Second thing that people need to understand is the vulnerability of this resource to change of any type, whether we're talking about changes in the high mountain watersheds themselves or changes in the climate that's responsible for delivering that snow and driving the runoff. The margin between supply and demand is so close in these areas that we're talking about that any little change, up or down, in the amount of incoming snow as well as the resulting runoff is going to have a profound effect on the way that people live and make a living far on downstream.
Of all Wyoming's natural resources, water is the most critical to our survival as a prosperous, diverse, and beautiful state. Water is also our most vulnerable resource, at the heart of a present-day dilemma that began 100 years ago. During the settlement of the West, good water was a primary concern. The lack or abundance of it determined where families could start their new lives. On the high, dry plains of Wyoming, they often had to settle for land near water. They learned one vital thing from their hard existence, that Wyoming's water is not much more than a yearly crop of melted snow. As Wyoming ranchers learned to live with the ebb and flow of seasonal streams, they made their own laws about flowing water, tying it legally to their land and protecting a way of life that was carved out of the dry landscape.
My involvement with water and water issues obviously happened when I married a farmer, and I was so interested in the process of putting water on the land. Probably one of my favorite jobs off the farm was when I worked with the Water Development Commissioner. I was a commissioner for this division. Seems like the more you work with water issues, the more interesting it becomes, and probably I learned a lot about compromise too, working with water issues.
When Wyoming settlers began to build dams and reservoirs, the downstream states made legal claims on the waters flowing out of Wyoming, leading to a series of hard-fought court battles beginning in the early 1900s. Today, a complex water allocation system divides up Wyoming's yearly snowmelt. 4 major river systems begin in Wyoming: the Platte, the Snake Columbia, the Yellowstone, Missouri, and the Green, Colorado. These river systems have been tightly managed for years and now have very little extra water. The Colorado River system is over-allocated, and the southwestern states downstream from Wyoming have historically used more than their allotments. The Colorado River is now the primary water source for 30 million people in the southwestern U.S. and Mexico. This arid region has a projected population of 40 million by the year 2020.
We're a state that only has somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 people, whereas there are individual suburbs in Las Vegas or Los Angeles that have more people than we have in the entire state. So when you look at the perceived need for Wyoming water in those downstream areas versus what people see as the value of using that water here locally, then there are bound to be conflicts.
Despite its agricultural heritage and small population, Wyoming is one of the leading states in energy production, mostly from coal and natural gas. Both of these industries are surprisingly water intensive to operate and support. If new water is needed by this expanding industry, it will most likely come through buying water rights from agriculture. Wyoming is also representative of a larger problem. The calculation of Western states' water shares in the early 1900s coincided with a period of unusually high moisture. Snowfall in the mountains was at historic levels, producing spring runoffs far above average.
The situation in the western United States, and Wyoming in particular, has always been one of really feast or famine when it comes to water. That if you look at long-term records, whether it's observations that people have taken from weather stations or going back much further in time using tree rings or other archives of that nature, what we see is that you're usually either really wet or you're really dry, and there's not much time that you spend in between. What climate change has the real potential to do, is very likely to do, is to magnify the swings that we take between those wet times and those dry times.
All of this, coupled with huge increases in downstream demand brought on by an exploding population in the Southwest, means that water supplies in the West will most likely decrease while the demand for Wyoming water continues to rise. How will Wyoming create strategies for taking the lead in responding to these changing conditions? How does a sparsely populated agricultural state protect its beauty, its people and their way of life, and its water? This is the dilemma that our film will explore and document.